Okay, so now we'll touch on quickly the second component of tape that I think really bears consideration. So, again, the first was the tape formula, and the second would be the tape width. And when it comes to tape width, the easiest way to think about it is the wider the tape, typically the higher fidelity, because the particles, those magnetic particles that are on the tape, are able to spread out more. And it also kind of lowers the noise floor. To go through some of the different tape widths, we're going to open up the Ampex ATR 102 because we can discuss and see here some different tape width options. The Studer, this one I believe was modeled after the one in Ocean Way, but the Studer is typically a 24 track and it's a 2-inch tape. So all the tape formulas on the Studer are modeled after the 2-inch tape formula, where on the Ampex we have the opportunity to switch to 1-inch tape, half-inch, or quarter-inch tape. Something to keep in mind when it comes to tape and the way that tape works is you would look at the total tracks the machine has to record on simultaneously, and that becomes your subdivision for space on tape. So for example, if it's a 24 track machine, that means each track occupies 1/24 of 2 inches. My math is absolutely not that sharp to give you that width right now, but that would be it. So the first one we'll look at is the quarter inch. Now, the quarter inch typically, definitely through the 70s, was used a lot in stereo mastering. Quarter inch tape can be very colored, very gritty, very vibey. It's a thinner tape, so the particles are, packed tightly together. So it's probably the most vibiest of the tape in that regard. I believe more recently the standard for mastering has become half inch, but a lot of these machines, it just depended on the widths that they could take. So some were outfitted to just be a quarter-inch machine, some half-inch, and some you could change the width of the actual tape that the machine could take. Then we move up to a half-inch, and a half-inch is definitely used a lot in stereo mix-down. So like if you were mixing two tape, mixing all your multi-tracks down, and then also in now mastering. And characteristics of half-inch are that it's very warm, it's bigger because again it's a bigger tape, so a little bit, so the particles are able to spread out a little more. I believe I read a quote once from Michael Brower saying that he used to love mixing down to his half-inch Studer, just love the sound of it. Next, we moved to 1-inch, and 1-inch was typically used, I believe it was like a lot of like 8-track machines. I know the Beatles, the J37 only gives us the option to use 1-inch tape. They don't even allow you to adjust tape formula, so I believe the tape on this is designed to be 1-inch tape, which 1-inch tape is a great tape for rock because I feel it accentuates the mid-range, and we're going to do some listening examples in a minute. I definitely feel that 1-inch brings out some mid-range. You might lose a little bottom, but it definitely has a punch that I feel is a little noticeable. And then, as we discussed to start, we have 2-inch tape, which tends to be the cleanest and the most high fidelity in that regard. And again, the easy way to think about tape is the wider the tape, the higher the fidelity, because the particles are able to spread out, and the lower the noise floor. So let's get into some listening examples here, and I'll discuss the way that I kind of queued it up. So we're going to go back to our drum loop, and if you guys, anybody that's been watching the tape series so far, I apologize in advance if you are absolutely sick and tired of this drum loop. The cross to bear with drum loops is they're just fantastic for being able to listen to how sources treat transients and easily able to latch your ear on to specific things because we're not dealing with too much melody where, we're basically dealing with almost like fixed pitches. So it's very easy to hear when the timbre gets manipulated by what we're running it through in regards to processing. So we have our drum loop set up, and I have two buses here. I have one that I'm calling the groove bus, and then one that's called the bus comparison. And on the groove bus, I have the Studer. Today we're going to use the 456 essentially as our baseline, properly calibrated, and I only had to bump the output just a little bit because I wanted to level match it to our second bus, which has one version of the ATR properly calibrated to quarter inch, one calibrated to half inch, and then we're going to switch over to the J37 to listen to 1-inch tape. With that, the only other thing I have on here is I have the Pro Q3s that are linked together, so we're only going to need to use this Pro Q3 here because it's linked to this so we can do the comparison, where the white lines going up will be showing us the EQ curve of the bus comparison, and the red line that'll be in there will be showing us the baseline that the Studer 456 is putting out. I had some L2s to check my ear in regards to leveling these two, and I'm proud to say that I got really close. I got within a 0.2 or 3 dB of these being almost spot on. So good day for the ears.
Victory is mine!
Okay, let's just do a quick little baseline of no processing. So we're gonna hear the groove bus with no processing at all. Now let's apply that 456 Studer. If you saw the last video, we know what it's doing. We're hearing that pitch of the snare kind of round off a little bit. We're hearing a little bit more kind of fluffiness to the kick drum. And our first comparison is going to be the ATR at 1/4 inch. And we're going to open up the Q3 and we're going to hear the ATR, but we're going to see in red the frequency curve of the 456. And then we'll just kind of toggle back and forth. So what we could see right off the bat is we're getting a bigger bloom in the low end from the 2-inch 456. We're also getting a little bit more kind of density in the mid-range. You could see the red spread out a little more, but the ATR actually was giving us more top end. You could see the white beating the red in the top, but the red essentially winning everywhere else. So now let's just kind of listen to these two. So the kick is up almost over 100. We could see a little bit of a bloom from the ATR over 100. It definitely tightens up when we're hearing the 1/4 inch. And when we switch back to the 2-inch, it feels thicker. And it also feels like a little bit like the lows extend more. To me, I'm hearing a little bit of buildup in the Studer, the 2-inch around the 400 mark. So let's hear this for a second. So they're much closer now. So this is definitely one of the areas where the Studer is kind of filling in and putting a little bit of weight and thickness in that area. So if we were trying to get the Studer to vibe a little bit more like the ATR, we'd probably roll off a little bit of the bottom. But this was the area that, to me, felt like it was clogging up the snare drum. We noticed that we were getting more top and that the snare felt a little bit brighter compared to the Studer. So here's the Studer. The snare doesn't have as much weight as it does with the Studer, but it has more kind of cut and clarity. And that also is what we're getting from the top end. So when we do compare these two, what do we notice about the 1/4 inch ATR is that it feels a little more polished because we're getting a little bit more crispness and brightness in the highs. We have a little bit less low mid buildup, and we don't also have a woofy low end. So the 1/4 inch tape kind of cleans up some things. So again, we can understand how that could work for rock, right? Because those are all the areas in rock that we're usually kind of making sure that we don't want any extra unnecessary weight kind of fuzzing up a mix that's designed to be very, big or punchy. Okay, let's move on to 1/2 inch ATR. And let's see. Now, as we start moving up in tape width, it should start to close the gap for, this is a Captain Obvious, right? It should start to close the gap to the 2-inch. So we should start getting a little bit more low end back and losing a little bit more top end as we go to the thicker tape. So we can see that by basing it off the red and the white, that the Studer, the 456, still has a little bit more oomph in the low end based off the meter. They're much closer in the mid-range. The Studer still seems to be just a little bit kind of broader in the way it kind of blooms out in the mids, and they're relatively close in the highs again. So I'll keep this up, but now we'll actually toggle back and forth between the two and see if your ear can hear some of the things that the graph is showing us. So So you can see how the kick feels pitched just a little bit higher. Not as high and punchy as it felt with the quarter inch, but it feels a little higher. And the snare, same thing, just a little bit kind of snappier. It doesn't have as much weight. So here we go again. You can listen to the kick in terms of where the kick is sitting on each tape width, the 2-inch versus the 1/2 inch, and then also the kind of weight or snap in the snare drum. So yeah, the kick is a little bit tighter still on the 1/2 inch, and the snare is snappier. It doesn't have the body, like the weight that or the warmth that the 2-inch does, but it is still kind of snapping through. And then the top end feels pretty consistent. It feels very warm and kind of, like rounded over in both of them. So now moving right along. Now let's go to 1-inch. And then actually to keep it apples to apples, I will also, as like a bonus, we will evaluate the 1-inch here. That way, we can hear if there's any differences between the J37 and the ATR as well. But we'll keep the J37 open, bypass, and let's bring up the frequency analyzer. Now, what we should feel or see here is that the 37 should definitely feel more mid-rangey, like it's just a punchier sound. So we'll start first looking at the graph, and we'll just listen to the 37 for a second. So if you watch this 589 frequency, watch the white versus the red, because that's kind of what I'm hearing. That's that mid-range that I'm kind of hearing. That kind of thwack on the snare drum is cutting through. So let's take a listen to these in comparison now. We'll start with the 2-inch Studer, get that in our ears, then we'll switch over to the 37. What I am anticipating is the 37 will probably feel punchier in the mids. Not snappier like the 1/4 inch and the 1/2 inch Ampex ATR, but let's see. I'm going to guess punch. So the snare doesn't feel as thin to me as it did on the other 2 tape widths. And there's definitely a lot of crack, which is why we're talking about 1-inch a lot of times being good for rock. So you could hear again how this might not be a bad formula for, rock music, classic rock music, where we definitely have, some strong lows, not the bloom that we're still getting from the 2-inch, but we're getting a lot of that mid-range crack, which is nice for rock music and especially for drums. Okay, so now we'll just do a quick side-by-side listen, and I would guide your ear to the 500 area again, and let's see if the ATR handles that mid-range the same way the J37 did, or if there's just a different vibe via the 2 different machines that we're using as well. So I'm going to start. We're going to hear the 1-inch ATR 456 Ampex formula, and let's keep an eye in this area. But feel free to let the eye roam and see if there's any other areas where the white and red are different from each other. So more low end from the 2-inch, a little bit more extension, if you caught that, on the top with the 2-inch. And they were kind of 50-50. Sometimes it looked like the red was overdriving the white in the mid-range. So let's now just use our ears to see what it sounds like to us. We'll start with the 2-inch, again, as our baseline. So we're definitely getting some more mid-range snap without a doubt, and the low end's absolutely tightening up, and the highs feel similar. They're both kind of warm and rolling off. So the 1-inch, even with the ATR, definitely still holds its kind of reputation for being punchy in the mids, having a tighter low end, and most likely being good for rock. Let's just quickly, since we're here having fun today, let's just do a quick comparison between the 37 and the ATR in terms terms of 1-inch tape formulas. Now, the other thing too, I should note with 37 is they didn't use the same formula. So we do a different tape formulas. We're on the 815, which is their highest fidelity formula, and everything else is set as close as we could. So the 37 wouldn't be, the super apples to apples, but hey, this is audio engineering, right? Like, I mean, we use what we got. We trust our ears. So it's good to kind of understand the relationship that, and where this falls in regards to, 1-inch tape and how it manipulates sound sources. So let's just do a fast listen and see what happens. We're going to start with the 37. So the mid-range feels the same to me. The 37 is a little bit more transparent, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is modeled after the one in Abbey Road, and I believe the engineers at Abbey Road had designed these to be very clean and try to be as transparent as possible. So they weren't like, let's design a Mojo box. This was designed to be, I think, very clean and to be run clean. And of course, the Beatles were the Beatles and being all sorts of crazy and wanting to do all sorts of, experimental things would, find anything they could in the studio to manipulate it to create, unique sounds.
It's really beautiful, It's like crafting.
So I'm assuming the 37 being no different. However, the way it was set up was to be very clean, and this is modeled after that. So it feels very transparent. When we're in and out of bypass listening to the raw drums and the 37, there wasn't much difference. We didn't hear, like we did when we switched over to the 1-inch on the Ampex, that the highs became, inflated in terms of being accentuated and drawn out. The punch and energy in the mids felt pretty similar to me. So now if you keep your ear on that, we'll just do one more fast listen through of both of these. So you can just hear that shaker come to life when we engage the ATR 102. And if you listen to the snare drum, you can hear when we kick the ATR in, it's more of the air side of the snare drum that comes to life. And again, I feel that's a byproduct of how we saw we were getting some accentuated highs, which would also tie in again when, the whole theme of this series is going to be you can essentially design and modify your own tape machine to create your own sound. So how these machines are biased is going to be huge. The way that you calibrate your tape, how you set up your EQ drivers, as far as driving into the tape and then EQing, whether it's your playback head or your sync head. So there's lots of different ways that we can manipulate the sound. These videos would be 8 hours long if we went in and just got under the hood of everything and just kept kind of trying to match every single thing to itself to compare true apples to apples. So we're kind of taking these as this unit is designed to sound like the one from whatever space and kind of listening to it from that regard and then learning the controls on them so that we can change things the way that we want. So I quickly just reorganized these so we can do a quick last listening example to see if you hear things the same way that I do or different, and I'd love to know your thoughts on what you're hearing. But we're going to go down, or if you're thinking up, we're going to go up in terms of growing growing the width. So 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 2 inch. And let's just kind of listen. What I would say the first listen through, let's focus on the pitch and listen to the pitch of the kick. Feel like it's continuing to drop down if we're going from 1/4 inch, so our thinnest tape, to our widest tape, which is the way that we'll do it. Notice that? How like it feels like the drums are kind of dropping in terms of their dominant frequencies. And it almost feels like the drums are starting to sound lower, or the energy of the drums are shifting down. So again, this is something, and we'll do it one more time before we wrap, but something to consider. And this is just a tape formula that we're looking at right now and how it handles the overall kind of energy in the drums and where the weight and focus of the drum sits. So it's one more thing to keep in mind when you're putting putting a tape plugin on, or as you're putting a tape plugin on, and you're trying to decide whether or not you like the vibe, you now know, oh, let me maybe experiment with different formulas, because I know that each formula is going to kind of, have a different frequency response, different level of harmonic content. And then let me mess around with the widths, because the widths are actually going to, kind of focus in on where the weight or the energy of the part is speaking. So this time we'll start from the lowest and we'll go up and see if we hear it the same way. So starting with the 2-inch. Okay, so I hope you found this useful. Again, when we're talking about tape, the two things that we do want to keep in mind are the formula that we're using and the width of that formula. All right, so I'll see you in the next video where we actually break these machines down, the Studer A800, the J37, and the ATR 102 by Ampex, and I'm going to mix a song using only those 3 tape machines and nothing else. Okay, my friends, I'll see you then.